Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Carl Larson from RMCG, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be looking at field and landscape management for beneficial insects or arthropods. And today we've got some really great guest speakers lined up who I'll introduce very shortly, including some virtual farm visits as well, which we're really looking forward to bringing to you. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we do get started. If this is the first session that you've joined on GoToWebinar, you'll notice on the control panel there's a number of different buttons, including questions. So please type in any questions that you've got along the way and they'll come straight through to me, and I can put those to our presenters during the panel session later on. And there's also a handouts pane, and you'll notice there's a couple of PDFs and Word documents in there. Some really handy resources to take away with you from the session today. So you can just click and download those. There's a couple of really great fact sheets from Sturt Uni, VegNet, and also a fantastic biodiversity farm template from the Port Phillip and Westernport Catchment Management Authority. So today's guest speakers include Professor Jeff Ger from Sturt University, who we'll be going to first. We've also got Karen Thomas on the line from the Port Phillip and Westernport CMA, and Stephen Moore, a technical agronomist for EE Muir and Sons, joining us today from sunny Werribee South. Before we get into the first speaker, I wouldn't mind just hearing from you out on the line. So I'm just going to launch a poll very quickly, which should have popped up onto your screen, just asking how much experience you've got in attracting beneficial insects and actually using native veg insectaries in vegetable production. That just gives us a bit of an idea of who's on the line and how to pitch the info so it is suitable. So I can see just over half of us have voted now. I'll wait till we get up to about the 80% mark, not vaccination target, but percent voted. And we're almost 100% there. So I'll close that poll and just share the results back with everybody. So we've got a pretty big cohort, just under 50% with a bit of knowledge. So thank you for that. A quarter of us with not much, about a fifth or 20% with none but keen to know more, and around 10 or 15% up there with lots. So a bit of a spread, but really good to know who's on the line. So thank you for that. I'd like to now introduce Professor Jeff Ger. So Jeff is an ecologist best known internationally for advances in biological control and the exploitation of insect-plant interactions to develop innovative pest management strategies. And will be talking to us about one of his recent hort innovation projects. So Jeff, I'll hand over the controls to you now to bring up your presentation. And over to you.
Well, thanks, Carl, for that intro. And let me just ask, are you getting my presentation?
So we've got your desktop at the moment.
Okay, I'm just going to switch across, and with a bit of luck, you've got presentation mode now. Is that right?
We're good to go. Thank you.
Great stuff. Well, look, thanks for the intro, and let me just say, yes, I am a professor and I've done a lot of work on insect ecology and all this sort of stuff, but I do get my boots dirty on a fairly regular basis. I work a great deal with growers, and I'm also implementing these strategies on my own property just outside Orange. So hopefully what I'll say won't be too kind of airy-fairy, and you'll be able to see, I hope, the practical relevance of it. Now, obviously time is a little bit tight in the webinar today, so please treat what I'm going to show you and tell you as something of a flavour or an introduction to this area. And as Carl mentioned, there's a couple of fact sheets available via the webinar site. And the project that I'll be talking about mostly was funded over the past several years by Hort Innovation. And you can get the full project report and download it from the Hort Innovation website. just search for that project number there, VG16062, and you should find it over here. So let's just dive into some of the headline results from this project. So we're talking today about boosting beneficials in your crop. And I imagine, given the results from that straw poll that was taken just a minute or two ago, that very many of you would already be familiar with lots of these different types of beneficials that are potentially present in your crops. But I just thought, as a complement to those pictures there of some of the more familiar species, I might dwell for a second on a group called the Parasitoids, because these are possibly those that are least familiar to some of you. These are usually wasps, but nothing like the nuisance European wasps that we flick away. These wasps tend to be much, much smaller. Some of them are really tiny. For example, a well-known group called Trichogramma are only the size of a small full stop on a printed page. They're truly minute insects. And apart from the example that you see pictured there of a black parasitoid wasp attacking an aphid, there are other species that attack Lepidoptera insects, that's butterflies and moths, including diamondback moth and cabbage white butterfly, which you'd be aware are major pests in many types of our vegetables. So that's just some of the beneficials that we're trying to boost. Okay, so in practical terms then, about how to actually achieve this boosting, what I'll show you is work at 3 different scales. There are things that we can do within the field itself. There are things that happen at the scale of what's next door in the adjacent paddock. And then there are other effects that operate at a larger scale in the landscape. So I'll just unpick those for you in the next few slides. So first of all then, at the field scale, a very effective strategy we found was to establish within the crop nectar plants, such as those white flowering plants you can see in the photograph there. And effectively what they do, apart from the obvious thing of providing shelter for some beneficial insects, is that the nectar and also the pollen those plants produce are very attractive to beneficial insects, including the parasitoids I spoke about a short time ago. And luckily for us, those beneficials don't just stay in the flower strip, they do spread out into the adjacent crop and do some really useful work for us. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see some of the results from our trials, which took place on real commercial farms. And you can see there, I hope, that the orange coloured line is showing you the numbers of beneficial insects on the crop plants at different distances from those flowering strips. And it's very clear when you contrast the orange coloured line with the blue coloured line, which is our control treatment or our reference point with no flowers, that if you're close to the flowering plant strip, you get very many more beneficials per crop plant than if you're in an area away from the flowering plants. And that boosting of the beneficials diminishes over the scale of about 15 or 20 meters, which of course we can then use to devise a planting pattern. And if we're able to accommodate a flowering plant strip at say 30-meter intervals, it means that there's no area within the crop that is too far away from the nectar plant strips to derive some benefit. So we're getting a nice boosting of beneficials there. And then when we sampled the diamondback moth, this trial took place in a series of vegetable crops, by the way, across New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia. And I'm showing you here the mean results. When we crunched the numbers from all those trials, we found that on average, the flowering plants doubled the rate of parasitism of diamondback moth, our key pest, from these parasitoids. Now, of course, there's a cost to establishing these strips. There's some labour, and the seed itself is something of a cost. But when you crunch the numbers in terms of comparing the costs of having these strips against the extra value of marketable crop produced, so the undamaged crop, we get a benefit to cost ratio of 8:1. So for every $1 that you spend establishing these strips, you get $8 back. It's not a bad investment. All right, let's keep moving. And in this next slide, I'm just going to very briefly dwell on the 3 plant species that we found to be particularly useful. We have sweet alyssum, and we have cornflower and common buckwheat. So there's more information about these and the costs associated with them in the fact sheet that you can access off of this webinar web page. Suffice it to say, though, that the cost of buying this seed does pay for itself in terms of the extra biocontrol and crop protection that you get. Okay, now I mentioned that there are 3 kind of spatial scales over which effects can operate, and the second one that I'll talk about is the importance of the adjacent vegetation. And I don't really have time to go into a huge amount of depth with this. Rather, if you're interested in these sorts of effects, I'll refer you to these fact sheets. But suffice it to say that the nature of the adjacent vegetation, whether it's, for example, perennial pasture or a shelter belt or another vegetable crop, has a very big effect on the numbers of pests in your focal crop. Also, very big effects on the natural enemies that are present in your crop. And so potentially we can exploit this knowledge, and in these fact sheets, which you can look at later on, we've devised a series of kind of crib sheets. I'm showing you here an extract from the one that we produced for brassica growers, and there are others there for carrots and lettuce and capsicum and other crop species. But this essentially allows you to consider, okay, are there some particular natural enemies that I really want to promote? Or are there some particular pest species that I'm really concerned about in my district? And then working from that, you can look up across the top side of the table there, which of the adjacent vegetation or land use types will either promote those insects or suppress them. And of course, on these sheets, red means danger and green means a beneficial effect. So it's relatively relatively user-friendly to try and interpret this fairly complex matrix of data. Okay, now finally, the landscape scale. So remarkably, our research has shown that the beneficial insects in a given crop can arrive there from multiple kilometers away. It's really quite amazing how far some of these insects can move. And so you might be considering a particular field of Brussels sprouts or sweet corn, but the insects that are living there are really affected by what's happening at the larger scale. And in this slightly busy slide, I'm trying to show you what is the most important takeaway message about the effects of scale. So on the horizontal axis at the bottom there, where it goes from 0 to 70%, this is the proportion of the landscape within 1 kilometre of your crop that itself is cropland. So in other words, on the left-hand side, you're dealing with a farm that's located in amongst natural vegetation. And on the right-hand side, you're dealing with a scenario of a farm that's sited amongst many other farms. And the take-home message then is that if you are on the right-hand side of this graphic, you're going to get a very, very big benefit of establishing those flowering plant strips that I showed you a few slides back. Conversely, and this does rather make sense, if you're on the left-hand side of this graphic and you're farming, in an area that's mostly natural or semi-natural vegetation, don't bother with a nectar plant strip, because already in those sorts of landscapes, the beneficials are numerous and have got plenty of shelter and nectar from other sources. No need for you to add a flowering plant strip. Okay, and this is my last slide here, but just to kind of sum things up in terms of actions that you can undertake to improve the in-crop activity of beneficials. Well, you can use those strips that I've talked about, establishing them no more than 30 metres apart. To get the best bang for your buck, put them into something like a sprinkler row or a headland rather than take land out of production. And you can choose from a variety of different plant species that you can find on the fact sheets. The fourth point there is you can also use a strategy called trap crops, which I've not had time to go on, but you'll find information about that online. And at the landscape, some of the important considerations there are to try and preserve any uncultivated areas like riparian vegetation or shelter belts. But secondly, make sure that you control weeds effectively in those areas, so they're not just going to be a breeding ground for the crop pests. Okay, I hope you found that useful, and I'm happy to answer questions, which I think will be in a panel session after you've heard from the other speakers. So thanks for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. And some really great practical tips and tools there, particularly the lookup matrix. I really like the traffic light and the star key there, really nice and easy to follow. And some of those tips and tools at the end around the 4 actions in crop. That's fantastic. I'd like now to introduce our second speaker, Karen Thomas from the Port Phillip and Westernport CMA. So Karen's been working with the CMA for the last 8 years, and prior to that worked for Agriculture Victoria and the state government. Karen's got a Bachelor of Ecological Agriculture and a Diploma of Conservation and Land Management, and 25 years working in the ag sector. And I'm sure, as Jeff mentioned, would like to be with Steve today getting the boots dirty, but alas, we're beaming from our home offices. So Karen, over to you, and really looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Carl. Can you see my presentation?
We can, thank you.
Fabulous. Okay, I'm just going to move through it relatively quickly because we've only got the 10 minutes. So just, I'm going to talk a little bit about the multiple benefits of having an insectary planting, and in particular focus a little bit on some of the things that we've planted at Werribee. And I will also touch on some of the other plantings we've done on other horticulture enterprises as well. I'll show you all the pretty flowers. Some monitoring results from the demonstration sites we did a couple of years ago, and then we did do a cost-benefit analysis based on ladybirds, so I will go over that a little bit too. Just a really quick slide up front. Most of you that are growers would have a current integrated pest management strategy, if you like, for your farm. One of the things that you should consider adding into your IPM strategy under your cultural control methods is insectary planting. If this is a pathway you're going to go down, it's just a little bit of a heads up to add that into your IPM strategy as one of the methods that you're using. Okay, so some of the multiple benefits around having native vegetation on your farm. I like to do things that have multiple benefits so that you can tick off a number of different boxes. Obviously, it's the pollination and habitat. With Werribee, we've got some ground cover that we've put down. If you're planting shrubs and trees, you've got the shelter belts and the windbreaks as well. We have considered looking at filtration services, so using certain species that can help capture sediment before it hits those drainage lines. And it's the biodiversity values. I know farmers that have planted insectaries and used them in their planting applications to offset something, a building offset or something like that on their farm. And in particular, the one that hits the mark for me is around meeting your obligations if you've taken up environmental assurance programs such as Fresh Care, EnviroVeg, and some of those other eco-credential programs that you might be involved in. They all have a biodiversity section, and so this is something that you can be ticking the box for that as well. So where can you plant an insectary? These are just some photos of places where we've popped them on a number of different farms. The one at the top right is a containerized plant. So that's actually in a nursery setting. So nurseries, obviously, because they rotate crops through the nursery quite regularly, they can't have, it's very hard for them to plant. So they have these containerized gardens that they just move around on the forklift when they want to move them to an area that's got fairly mature plants, and they want to protect them before they're going out into the market. The other plants are just, other photos are just plantings that we've done, say around a U-pick on a berry farm. Down the bottom, it is a little tiny garden bed that's, that grassy area is actually now their car park for the U-pick. And we just utilised that garden bed that they had there. You can see it virtually had nothing in it. So we just popped some plants in there as well. And they've got adjacent blueberries, even though you can see the cow just off to the right is their blueberry crop. So and then on the left-hand side, that's their main shelter belt that we planted. You can see the blueberry crops there in the background. So we've just utilised space where they had it and put some species in that were suitable for that site selection. So at Werribee, and Steve's going to show you what some of these plantings are looking like now. So this is back in April. We looked at some of the embankments that lead up to some of the dam wall areas and looked at planting some species along those areas. So they're not production areas, they're areas that are currently, as you can see, just a lot of dirt. So we just utilised some of those spaces there. And the photo on the right is a strawberry farm, and they have their dam there, a massive grassy area. And so we just looked at how we could plant some shrubs and build up. What you can see is already some native vegetation around there. We just plugged some of the gaps around the dam and planted some vegetation through there. So the purpose of this is, these plantings are utilising unproductive areas on the farm. So we just look at the farm, find areas where we could do something better. So whether it is holding the soil in place a little better, or planting an area that's just, around that dam wall or around that dam area that we can just plant it out and not impact any space, but we're also very close to crops. So this is out at Werribee in April. So you can see that edge there is covered in quite a lot of weed cover, weeds that are often hosts to pest insects. And so we had a crew go in and clean all of that up and plant it out with some plants. And you can see the photo on the right is just how it was looking like afterwards. And we also mulched it as well, just to help hold everything in place there. So I'm going to go through some of the plant species soon about what we've planted there. But these are just photos to sort of highlight the different places where you can actually plant some of these plantings. So it doesn't have to be this massive shelter belt through the property if you don't have the space for that. Again, same Werribee South. These are some of the plants, what they're looking like now. And I think Steve's going to take you on a bit of a tour of those soon. So some of them are starting to kick along just nicely. The wind's just got up here, so I hope you can still hear me okay. These are some of the plants that we actually planted on these Werribee South sites, and there is a plant list that's been provided, I think, as a handout as well at the end if you want to access the PDF. So we use plants that do not get very tall at all, because obviously being close to an embankment for a dam, we didn't want to have massive root structures or anything like that. So we've planted a lot of ground cover species and very small shrubs. So the acacia there is a very small one. It's actually a prostrate heath wattle and very small, doesn't get very big at all, and it just sprawls along the ground. The daisies, you can see the kidney weed and the pig face, we planted them in massive proportions, and they obviously provide that matting ground cover, which also suppresses weeds as well, which means that there's a lot less maintenance that has to be done along these embankments if you're not having to try and manage these weeds that are host to a lot of the pest insects as well. Leptospermum is a really good one to plant if you can get it in. We planted that right down the bottom, so it's not on the embankment. Thriptane is a particular favourite of mine. Really, really tiny flower and full of nectar. I think it looks like a little jam tart, but this is particularly good for some of those really small beneficial insects that need some very small flowers to be able to get into. And the last photo, it's a bit difficult to see, but this is Dianella, and we've planted this out at Werribee just to see how it goes. It is a species that would do really well as a filtration species along drainage areas and areas like that where you want to actually capture sediment before it's entering into waterways. I've added this one in purely because it's a species that I really, really like. You can hedge it, as you can see on the photo on the left. It grows en masse, and as you can see, I took staff out into the middle of a roundabout in a suburban street, and where this is growing quite prolifically, and we did some checks and found it's covered in ladybirds and hoverflies, and that's what I found in some of the field sites that have planted it. So although we didn't plant it in Werribee, it's a species that I think could do really, really well with the type of farm layouts you've got across vegetable farms, and it doesn't take up too much space, but it could also be used as a hedge as well. All right, so just some of our monitoring results. My screen's telling me I don't have good internet connection, so hopefully it's all right. In total, we had, I'm just going to move something out of the way, which is holding up my screen. Sorry about that. We had over 97,000 invertebrates that were counted across the 3 years. And there was an abundance of ladybirds that increased by a factor of 5 over those 3 years. 12,000 parasitoids collected, where the abundance of those trebled over the 3 seasons. We found 4 times as many lacewings, and predatory bugs increased by 4 times, and rove beetle numbers doubled. So this is the monitoring we did over 3 seasons after we planted insectaries on 4 different properties. So we did a nursery, strawberries, a vineyard, and an orchard. And so we measured using sticky traps. We measured the number of insects over a 3-year period and monitored for those increases. So from that, we tried to do a bit of a cost benefit analysis. So I'll try and explain my way through this as easy as I can. So you've got a sticky trap that's 10 centimeters by 17 centimeters. And if you had 10 of those across and 6 down, so about 60 traps, that equates to about 1 meter of vegetation. So if you had 60 traps, and the table at the top left shows us that on average, we were trapping 5 ladybirds per trap. So that gives us 300 ladybirds for every meter of flowering vegetation as an average. So back when we did this in about 2017, ladybirds were worth about $1.10 each. So they're giving you about $330 worth of ecosystem value. So you start to multiply this by the actual area that you've got planted, that's just for 1 meter. You can start to see there's some pretty significant cost benefits to this. So the cost to plant a metre of vegetation is about $6 for the plants, $6 for tree guards, 10 metres for fencing if you're going to put it in, plus your $30 an hour for maintenance, so about $52 per metre. And out of that, you're getting that $330 worth of ecosystem value. And that's just ladybirds. So you've got to start to think about all of the other beneficial insects that are using that vegetation, such as your hoverflies, lacewings, and parasitic wasps. So when you start to look at the value of all of those in combination, there's the potential to get a massive value out of just doing these small things in areas around the farm. So just, some last little facts. An adult female can eat more than 100 aphids before she lays her eggs, and they consume 2,400 aphids during their lifetime. So if we had those 300 ladybirds, and they're each eating 2,400 aphids, we've got 720,000 aphids that are being eaten just by those 300 ladybirds. So it's a lot of ecosystem value to actually have this flowering vegetation that's providing these nectar sources to support beneficial insects. Just really quickly, I'm going to go over some of the observations that we made during these 3 years. Obviously, when you're monitoring, you get seasonal conditions. So some years we had massive populations of ladybirds, and other years hardly any. And likewise, we had 1 year in particular where hoverflies were just in huge numbers. And so you can assume that some of that is not just the influence of having nectar around, but it's also seasonal influences as well. So you do need to factor that in. So things are going to fluctuate. For us, it was about the diversity. So obviously having a diversity of plants around that support different insects feed in different ways. So just having different types of flowers around supports the different feeding habits of the different beneficial insects that you're trying to attract. Obviously, farm management practices are going to have an impact on beneficial insects, so it's something to think about when you're doing this. And I guess last of all, having an insectary is going to offer that stable habitat for resilience against input practices and pest incursions. And by having that habitat around, you've always got a population of beneficial insects ready to go. Just finishing up, what next? So, you know, talking with the agronomists and the growers out in Werribee, there's a strong interest in looking at ways that some of these channels through the Werribee South District could be better utilised for insectary planting. So at the moment, they're just very weedy, harbouring a lot of pests because of the weed burden. So there's the opportunity to potentially plant these out with suitable species and also offer that filtration service as well. So if we plant species that could attract beneficial insects, but also include species that are going to capture sediment as runoff from the adjacent crops, then we're going to get an extra benefit from that as well. And I just wanted to link that back into the Fresh Care Environmental chapter on water to show that there's a link between, again, if we were to plant these areas, you're also going to get the benefit through your environmental stewardship program. And lastly, it's been mentioned, I have put together a bit of a farm biodiversity plan. Some of you may have seen it. It is targeted towards veggie growers, sort of, I guess, looking at closing the gap around the biodiversity chapter in the Fresh Care Environmental scheme and supporting growers to actually make sure that they've got ways that they can address the steps within that biodiversity chapter. I did create a template as well. I'm happy for people to use it and to provide feedback because it is just the first go. So if people don't find it as user-friendly as we think it might be, then to give me feedback so that we can improve it and hopefully generate those farm biodiversity plans that you can then attach to your Fresh Care Environmental chapter to say this is how you're addressing biodiversity on vegetable farms. And that's just the finish off slide. I won't go through it, but that's the full plant list that we used at Werribee South. And like I said, a very big focus on very small shrubs and ground covers, just so that we weren't having any impact on the dam integrity, but also making sure that we can smother out a lot of weeds by using species that should over time be able to outgrow them. So that full plant list is available as a PDF, I think, as part of this webinar. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. A really nice practical snapshot of what's been happening not only in the vegetable industry, but also others, so berries and wine grapes as well. And that all important question of, you know, species lists, I think you've covered there really well, and we do have that handout ready for people to download. I'd like to now cross to Stephen Moore out in the field in Werribee South. We've heard a lot about the plantings back in April. Stephen, you're going to take us through what the site's looking like now and also what you've been hearing from some of the participating growers. So welcome, and over to you. Sorry, Stephen, we might just get you to unmute there. The wind was picking up in Werribee South. There we go. We've got you now. Thank you.
I'm battling the wind here, so hopefully you can hear me okay. It's actually a good reason to plant more trees, just to slow down the wind that does cause some damage in the vegetable crops. As you can see behind me, this bank is quite steep. One of the dams, it's adjoining one of the dams that's lined, and you can see the plants are starting to establish, which is under 6 months ago that they were planted. So I'm going to take the camera off myself and try and walk through it and hopefully show you a bit closer what's going on. Fortunately, I can't see what you can see, but I'm just walking along here, and you can see already that the pig face has grown quite an amount. But unfortunately, there's quite a lot of weeds amongst there, as you can probably see, like chickweed and other weeds. But it is part of the reason for planting the plants too. Rather than spraying glyphosate every few months, the idea is that we hope these native plants will establish and outcompete the weeds, and then there will become hopefully a low maintenance area for the growers. So currently some growers will go through and hand hoe these out. I just saw some of the mulch just drop there, but it's actually held up quite well, considering at one point just after planting we had about 100 mils of rain in one event, and I was expecting to see most of it down the bottom of the track here, but it actually stood up quite well. One thing though I think we could have done to outcompete the weeds would be to apply it a bit thicker, but that doesn't probably suit some of the smaller plants, especially some of these ground covers. I'll just try and show you one there that tends to struggle a bit with the mulch as it gets covered. One thing about the tree guards, they're quite good, but being cardboard, they do sometimes shrink a little bit and don't stay open, and that can be a problem, but they are protecting the plants. I'll just try not to trip over here. And hopefully you can see down into the plant there. It's got some flowers already and it's looking quite healthy, and they do work well. One of the concerns we had with the plants was that they might harbour pests. I'm just scanning into the crop here, and you might be able to notice that there's actually a lot of plants missing, and it is a common problem. Often we get hares and birds that come across, but this planting has not contributed to this effect. We just hope it doesn't get any worse. Moving a bit more, but I was going to try and show you just some of the areas that we start with around the corner. It's a bit hard to show the big face at the top. It's certainly growing well. It's a bit more sunlight. It's getting a bit too windy, but just trying to show you.
We might get you to speak a little bit closer to the microphone. We're just picking up quite a bit of wind.
Yeah, I'm getting back.
Crosswind there.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to show you, but I'm as close to the mic as I can get. So yeah, I think that's about all really. Like, it's been a very good and exciting project for us. We hope the beneficials will establish soon as spring is just on us. We haven't quite seen any. We did have some snail problems on one side, but that's not uncommon for that area anyway. And some harlequin bugs seem to like harbouring in the tree guards. But yeah, we're certainly looking forward to seeing these plants grow bigger and establish, and see what the results will be in the next 6 months. So, is there anything else you'd like to see?
No, Stephen, that's a really good overview of the site. Thank you for that. And it's really nice to get out in the field virtually, at least for some of the New South Wales Vic and ACT people on the line I know that are joining us today. You mentioned weed pressure a little bit there, and hand chipping out rather than spraying out. And Karen and Jeff, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too. Is that something that you're seeing elsewhere, and a bit of a challenge with these native veg insectaries, that you do have to go back in regularly from a weed management perspective?
I guess, yeah, it's a comment. It's probably not too onerous. We think there will be a bit of work in establishing, but we're hoping the ground covers will really outcompete the weeds, and then hoping that it will become a low maintenance scenario. So they've probably hoed this once before. I know another grower's hoed twice in 5 months, but it's not uncommon for them to be hoeing the plants in the field anyway. So to have a team just go in, it is a cost, but one that they're willing to deal with in the short term. So it's just whether it becomes a long-term problem that there would be an issue for all the growers.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I'd probably
Steve.
follow up. I'd probably follow up and just say, you know, there is going to be that, if you like, that change over time. You know, going from an area that's either just had a weed burden on it, which you've got to manage anyway, if you want to get rid of the the weeds that are potentially harbouring pests, which is right next to the crop. So you've got to do it anyway. But over time, hopefully, if you plant the right species, you're going to get that ground cover. So this was an objective of the growers, was to have species that would mean that they could reduce over time their weed management along that area. So that's what we're sort of, I guess, testing out as well, is what species attract the beneficial insects with, but also provide that that ground cover that's going to protect the soil. It's going to reduce the weed burden, but it's going to take time. You know, the pig face is looking pretty good actually, in terms of it's only been in for a couple of months and we've had winter. So, you know, we also want fast growing things as well. The kidney weed, the mulch probably won't bother it too much, Steve. It'll, you know, although it's much smaller, it's kind of like native, you know, those violets. It just grows underground and suddenly it'll just pop up everywhere one day across there. So although it's much smaller, it's not going to grow as quickly as the pig face. Pig face is quite common along our coastal areas, so it's probably loving it. Yeah, so I think overall, it is part of the cost, and it's part of the startup. But over time, it shouldn't be too much of a burden.
I think the mulch could have been thicker to prevent more weeds coming up, but it's not that easy.
Yep.
Situation.
So for my part, what I'd add to what's been said already, and I acknowledge the very important point that the weed control would probably have to have been done anyway, so it's not an additional cost. But it's worth perhaps making the point that although this particular webinar is about the use of native plants, and although there are really distinct advantages of using native plants, we're not locked into that, and we can use non-native plant species that still deliver plenty of benefits to plants. And one of the advantages of using non-native plants is that seed is very cheap, readily available, and these are cultivars that have been bred to leap out the ground and grow quickly and exclude weeds through competition. So something like buckwheat, to take an example, is very, very quickly going to outcompete weeds if you grow it, you know, at the right time of the year and a bit of moisture is available. So many people have got a kind of a philosophical kind of wish to grow natives, and I respect that, and they've really got their place. But if you're really looking at this from a hard-nosed perspective of suppressing pests, then don't necessarily dismiss the use of non-native plant species.
No, thanks, Jeff. We've had a couple of questions come through from our audience, so thanks for typing those into the question panel there. Keep them coming in. Rana's just asked how often beneficial insects should actually be released into a crop, considering the native veg plantings. Jeff, I might start with you and then hear from our other panelists.
Yeah, well, look, perhaps the simplest way of answering that is, with a bit of luck, never, because the whole idea of using these sorts of approaches is that you're building up a kind of resident community of beneficials that, despite occasional spraying or harvest operations and establishing new crops, they'll be available to move into a newly planted out area from these reservoirs, from the donor habitat, and nip pest infestations in the bud. That's not to say that you can't then turn to inundated release of insects that you might buy from a commercial supplier if there was a particular need to deal with a flare-up of a very threatening pest. And the trichogramma parasitoid wasps that I mentioned in my talk are an example of a biological control agent that you can buy in relatively cheaply and often can give you just that extra layer of control if your naturally occurring community of natural enemies isn't quite doing the job at a particular time of vulnerability.
No, thanks, Jeff. And Karen, did you want to add anything to that, just from the beneficial interaction that you're seeing out perhaps in other sectors too?
I'd say, yeah, I agree with Jeff on that, and certainly that's what a lot of the leading IPM specialists will say as well, is that we shouldn't have to necessarily buy insects if we've got nature doing the work for us. There's certain situations where it is definitely something that you would consider. So, for example, if you know that it's going to be a really bad year for insects, you might want to be buying in certain ones just to cover that seasonal risk. The other scenarios I can think of too is particularly around protected cropping. Obviously, it's a lot more harder to get beneficial insects flying in if you've got protected cropping in place. So, in those sorts of structures, you probably are going to have to include purchased biological agents. And the other time where it might be necessary is if you've had natural disaster. And so those are the people that are growing in areas where there's bushfire. So even if your property is not impacted by bushfire, obviously all the vegetation in your surrounding landscape may have been. So in situations like that, it might be of value to have purchased insects as those backups.
No, thanks, Karen. And thanks for those questions. I might get to a couple more now. One from Andy, thanks for that. Just asking our panelists, is there a need to prevent seeding in crop plantings? I'll open to that up to all, and perhaps hear from Steve first up. And sorry, Steve, I've just put you on mute again. You might just need to unmute just to prevent some of that background wind. I know it's picking up out where you are, so we can hear you now.
Sorry, there's a question again about seeding. I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, is there a need to prevent seeding in the crop plantings? So looking at that interaction between your strip plantings and your actual cash crop.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that is one of the concerns I think growers have, is that the strip plants may become a weed and germinate. So I would have thought the preference would be to not allow them to seed, but it depends. Again, if you're trying to establish a regenerative area which self-pollinates, then you probably want to keep the seeds there. And the herbicides we use in the field, probably, as long as they're knocking that plant out amongst the crop, it should be okay, I think.
No, thanks, Steve. Jeff.
Yeah, so from my experience, growers really appreciate a scenario of where they do it once. They establish these features in the environment just once, and after that, it takes care of itself. So if you're sowing an annual plant like alyssum, it's one of those in my talk, each individual plant is an annual, but they do seed quite prolifically. So a strip of alyssum becomes a perennial feature just of its own accord. But the weed risk is not significant. I say that for two reasons. One is because the areas adjacent to the strip are cultivated regularly as part of normal farm operations. So that cultivation will take care of any alyssum seedlings that are growing out of place. Secondly, this plant is super common in ornamental gardens all over the country, and it has not become an environmental weed. So it's not one that has kind of the ecological characteristics that lend itself to becoming kind of like an aggressive invader plant. So I think in most instances, you're not going to see any risk of these plants going wild and creating a problem in the crop or in the wider environment.
Thanks, Jeff. And while we're with you, we've just had another question come through on the benefit cost ratio that you mentioned in your presentation of 8:1. Now, I'm no economist, but that looks like a pretty good ratio to have. For every dollar you're getting $8 back.
Absolutely.
What's contributing to that high ratio in the benefits there? What constitutes the $8 worth of benefit?
It's avoiding downgrading of crop plants as a result of pest damage. So the analysis was conducted in a series of trials on brassica farms, and we were finding that the level of control of beneficial insects in the areas where those nectar plant strips were established was significantly higher than in unprotected areas, conventionally grown areas. And so that was the estimated farm gate value of the extra first grade marketable crop that was the contributor.
Oh, great, thanks for
I should
clarifying.
say that, sorry, I should just, you know, in the interest of being open, say that that was the best case scenario amongst the various economic models that we ran, and it assumed that the strips are being established in non-cultivated areas like sprinkler rows and headlands. Clearly, if you take land out of production to put these strips in, then you're going to take a hit because there's foregone production from that area.
Thanks, Jeff. Some really good points there. And Karen, I might just follow up from that. Some of the numbers that you'd run, there were some pretty significant figures in there. 720,000 pest species being consumed or controlled. Do you find that having those numbers and them being so large is actually really important when you're chatting with growers and others out in the industry about these native veg plantings?
Absolutely. I think that you certainly need to have a cost benefit done on it as best as you can. So like I said, that's a couple of years old, so maybe a ladybird costs more now. So I think that it's really important when you're talking to farmers about what the benefit is. It's not just about, you know, we saw lots of more ladybirds and we saw lots more of this. You actually need to have, you know, well, this is how much it costs. This is the benefit you're going to get it from it. This is the productive benefit you might get from it. And so I think that messaging really helps to convince a lot of people that this is a worthwhile process to pursue. The other thing I was just going to make a comment on too was back just with the seeding stuff. We avoided using native grasses, which is something that I like to use in insectaries, but it was because of that concern around native grasses self-seeding into the cropping areas that we haven't planted them in these situations. But if you've got areas where you've not got that sort of concern, adding native grasses in is of huge benefit because that's where the brown lacewings will breed, and that's their preferred habitat. So you're going to get huge amounts of brown lacewings if you've got native grasses. But I just, thought I'd mention that in terms of the plants we've used, we try to use ones that we're not likely to self-seed terribly much. So I think overall, a cost benefit is definitely a worthwhile process to actually put to this. I'd love to be able to do a more up-to-date one rather than the back of the envelope, which is what we did with that one. It was just sat down and worked out, well, you know, what's the benefit, what's the cost, and does it look attractive?
Thanks, Karen. And Jeff, you mentioned earlier just those different scales of considering managing these beneficial insects. One of those was in crop and at the field scale. For those growers starting out in the vegetable industry, what are your top 2 tips for getting started?
I think the top tip would be just start. Boffins like myself can do all sorts of experiments and give ideas, but there are always going to be unanswered questions. So if a grower was just going to say, well, I'll wait till the boffins have ironed out all the wrinkles from this scheme before I implement it, we'd never really get anywhere. So I think you just got to kind of dive in and do some kind of messing around on your own property. Do it in an informed way. So look at fact sheets and other stuff that's available online, but just dive in and see what works under your circumstances.
Thanks, Jeff. And Stephen, some of the feedback you've had early on from growers in that Werribee South district, using it as our kind of case study for today, what's some of the early feedback or questions you've had from them out that way? And I might just get you to unmute too, just we've done that for the background noise again.
It's just, I had to wait for it to pop up to unmute. The growers are, I guess one of the biggest concerns in starting was just knowing what plants to select for, and Karen has a fantastic resource there for people to use in plant selection, and that's been fantastic. The growers certainly are optimistic, but they're still waiting, I guess, to see how the plants will establish and whether there will be any potential pests that harbour in the area. But we're hoping that won't be the case, given they're natives. we expect there'll be some really good beneficial numbers, and that will flow into the crop. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And Karen, Steve touches on a pretty important point there. I mean, we've mentioned the species listings and what to plant and some resources around that. The second one that probably comes to mind immediately, building on Jeff's point of just giving it a crack, where do you get these plants from?
Yep, most common question always asked. Again, there's a resource for that. We source most of our plants generally from community nurseries, because they're a hell of a lot cheaper. So you're paying about $2 to $3 per tube stock. They're growing to your local conditions, which means you can go in there, and if you know what sort of plants you're looking for, they're going to be able to help you automatically say, I want some shrubs, I want flowering shrubs, these are the ones I'm after. They will have them from seed that's been collected from your local area. So there's a lot of benefits, plus you're also supporting obviously a local community group. So lots of benefits around that. There's plenty of them. So Greening Australia do have a really good list. It's a couple of years old, but I've checked through it and most of those nurseries still exist. So I have provided it to Dimmy as a resource for people to share from. Shire Council is probably the easiest way to get access to where your local community nurseries are, is go to the Shire Council, look them up on their website. I've checked a few, they're all there. Werribee has them. And yeah, give them a call and you can pre-order. So if you know in advance what you want, pre-ordering over the summer months is a good time. They'll propagate them up, ready for you to plant in sort of autumn, winter. So best time of year to plant is autumn and winter, just for the coolness and not having to obviously use too much water to get them established. And then once the spring and summer heats up, you don't have to do anywhere near as much watering, if at all. So yeah, that's the sources for getting that information. Local community nurseries are your best bet, because if you go to the commercial ones, you don't know where they've sourced the stuff from. And I often hear people say, I bought this stuff from here and it all died. And I'm like, yeah, well, there's reasons for that. As nice and handy as they are, and we all do it, there's also reasons why, if you're planting something like this, if you can get local seed stock and tube stock, that's a much better way to go.
Fantastic, thanks, Karen. And I'd like to just thank each of our presenters that have joined us today. We've heard the fascinating spectrum, I think, of insights from research out to practitioner to agronomists, and even had the chance to go into the field. So I really do appreciate that. I'd like to just quickly pass over to our Regional Development Officer for VegNet, Dimmy Kyriakou, who's done a stellar effort organising today's session. But Dimmy, just quickly, where can growers and other industry members go for further info and keeping in touch with yourself?
No worries. Thanks, Carl. And thank you all for your great presentations today. So if you'd like to find some more information, we have this webinar recording will be available on the Soil Wealth and Integrated Crop Protection website. So there's the first link up there. And also we house most of our resources, including fact sheets, case studies and upcoming events on the AusVegVic website. So that's ausvegvic.com.au. And also always happy to chat to anyone who's got any questions, or if I can help further. So you can just give me a call, my mobile 0488 124 626, or dimmyk@rmcg.com.au.
Fantastic, thank you, Dimmy. And thank you all for joining us too. It's been great to have your participation, and thanks very much for firing through those questions. We've got to most of them, and apologies if we just ran short of time to get to those last couple of outstanding ones. But we look forward to seeing you at the next event, and thanks very much. Enjoy the spring sunshine. Bye, everybody.